Next, we have our own communication officer, Chris Monaghan from University of Worcester, who will talk about the origins and decline of parliamentary impeachment in the UK and how it could be modernized.
So in my presentation, I'm looking at whatever happened to impeachment in the UK. So looking at accountability, history, and the decline of parliamentary impeachment. So this is on the basis of my doctoral research at King's College London, which I've pursued on a part-time basis and just finished quite recently, over about 7 years. So my research has really looked at the use of impeachment in what is now the UK. So starting off in England and Britain and looking at its historic use and using a number of case studies to understand how it's used. So in my research, I looked at the revival of impeachment during the beginning of the 17th century, during the reign of James I, from 1621 onwards, the actual revival. Then I looked at the use of impeachment during the conflict between the Whigs and Tories at the end of Queen Anne's reign and the beginning of George I's reign in the beginning of the 18th century. I then looked at the impeachment of Warren Hastings and the impeachment of Viscount Melville, the final impeachment. The kind of key issue was to try and identify moments of political importance facing the country and how parliamentary impeachment could be used to act as a way to engage with these challenges, political and constitutional, and to actually offer a solution or some form to enable the Commons to hold the powerful government officials to account. Now, it's very, looking at these examples, a fair degree of partisanship, political game playing, especially during the disputes between the Whigs and Tories in the beginning of the 18th century. And I think that's one thing with impeachment within the use in this country is, I suppose in many countries, is this concern that it's partisan, problems of fairness, and also using the actual impression of a legal basis for the trial element for political ends. So I really looked at impeachment as an accountability mechanism and was trying to actually work out, could impeachment be used again today? Could it be revived to buttress the existing political accountability mechanisms? I mean, that in itself actually led me to look at why impeachment declined and the emergence of alternative mechanisms over time. So in the 18th century, use of impeachment against senior officials once they left office. And you had the threatened use of impeachment against the first so-called Prime Minister, Walpole, where Walpole actually realizing that he had lost the confidence of the Commons, resigned, and attempts to then impeach him were dropped. So you have this emergence of this idea that the government, the Prime Minister, must have the support, must have the confidence of the Commons. If you lose or you threaten to be losing that support, then to resign as leader. So it was a way it was another way to actually remove ministers and prime ministers from office without resorting to impeachment. So the question really was, I mean, in terms of these alternative mechanisms, such as development of ministerial responsibility during the 19th century, idea of ministers being responsible to Parliament, the development of the conventions, and this modern understanding of the parliamentary system at Westminster, could impeachment actually be revived to buttress these mechanisms? What could impeachment actually offer? Well, before I actually go and answer this question, I wanted to kind of think about impeachment and how, to British eyes, it's kind of represented. So in terms of popular culture, impeachment does feature a fair bit in American television dramas and films. Quite recently, the FX network has run Impeachment: American Crime Story, which is currently airing on the BBC, about the Clinton impeachment due to his affair with Monica Lewinsky in connection to the Paula Jones lawsuit. In the popular comedy Veep, which was spearheaded by British writers, in Veep, the Vice President, Selina Myers, becomes president after the then president resigns to escape an possible impeachment. The same in the Netflix's House of Cards. The titler, Frank Underwood, becomes president because the current president, that then president, resigns due to threat of impeachment. And we can kind of see in how it's played out in the news media with Clinton. And this is really interesting when we start thinking about how impeachment is debated in Parliament, especially in about 2004 around Tony Blair and Iraq. So lots of references are made to Clinton and the States. Now we have had an unprecedented 2 US presidential impeachments of Donald Trump, 2019 and 2021, once when Trump was in office and once after Trump had left office. And interestingly, in terms of actually impeaching a president once they've left office, US lawmakers turned to actually a British precedent, that of Warren Hastings, who was impeached after he resigned as Governor General of Bengal. In terms of actually the history, to understand impeachment, we can see the origins in 1376 with the Good Parliament and the impeachment of Lord Latimer and others. And this kind of goes through a series of stages and usages, periods not being used, until we've got the final impeachment, that of Viscount Melville in 1805. Melville, a leading figure of William Pitt the Younger's administration, was impeached for financial irregularities with the Navy, naval funds, but he was acquitted the following year in 1806. What's really interesting from my research is that we had a serious-ish attempt to impeach Tony Blair in 2004 in relation to the invasion of Iraq. And we could see there was a motion on the order paper with about 20 MPs put forward to impeach Tony Blair. MPs included the now Viscount Hailsham, so then Douglas Hogg, and Edward Garnier, who would become David Cameron's Solicitor General. We also actually had support of leading lawyers, Conor Gearty and now Lord Justice Singh, in a legal opinion in which they actually set out the case for the legal status of impeachment. One impeachment that kind of does weigh heavy is perhaps the most famous impeachment of them all in terms of British history, that of Warren Hastings. Now, I had a very lovely slide with caricatures and satire from Hastings Impeachment, which I've put a photo on Twitter, but I was hoping to share. But the representation of Hastings impeachment on popular culture in the late 18th century and how this is remembered today is very important. Hastings' trial was the penultimate impeachment in this country. It lasted 7 years, from 1788 to 1795, and was seen as a way for Parliament to challenge the abuse carried out by servants of the English East India Company, of which Hastings was the chief administrator in Bengal. And in terms of accountability, it demonstrated how Parliament had tried through repeated attempts of legislative reform to reform the company and its abuses, most notably that the company employees in India were actually profiting from their position and mistreating local residents and entering into very advantageous trade deals to make a fortune. And so there's a sense that the company's officials were corrupt, and Hastings, it was regarded by many, had not done anything really to counter this, and indeed had profited himself. So there'd been a failure to actually see any reforms actively curb this, which led to the impeachment of Hastings, which was then followed by reform just before the impeachment, but by fresh reform. So I was thinking, in terms of accountability, what would happen if the British state was confronted with a modern day Hastings, a modern day corporation that was seen to be too big to fail, but unaccountable, corrupt, and raises a lot of issues? Well, we'd have, for example, parliamentary oversight, select committees, we'd have questions in Parliament, the government could establish a public inquiry, perhaps under the Inquiries Act 2005. We could have legal action through the courts. We could have prosecutions or legal actions brought by NGOs, pressure groups, or individuals. We could also have, because it'd be corporate, we could also have shareholder action as well under the Companies Act 2006. And ultimately, we could have legislative reform. But also, where we have an issue of grave issues of lack of accountability, traditionally there'll be a role for impeachment, but what now? I'm setting out my research in a book which is coming out next year, Accountability, the Constitution and Impeachment, the Case for a Modernised Process in the UK, which will be published by Routledge next year. What I propose to do is to look at the normative purpose of impeachment as empowering the House of Commons to hold powerful people to account by way of a mechanism to actually force a resolution and determination of wrongdoing. What I've argued is that the way we understand how impeachment operated should be amended. Impeachment should, if we are going to actually keep it as opposed to formally abolish it by way of legislation, then we should actually revise what we mean by impeachment. And what I would really want to see is any revised version of impeachment to buttress political accountability mechanisms which exist, but not to supersede them, but to support, not to dominate. And would be to actually have a real focus on the executive, on the executive's compliance with accepted constitutional norms. And we can see through the current administration grave concerns about willingness to bypass accepted norms of the Constitution. For example, we can see the prorogation, so misuse of prerogative power. We can see, for example, with failure to enforce the ministerial code as well, which is very, very important in terms of our Constitution. So it's very much about focusing on the executive and the executive's compliance with the Constitution and empowering the House of Commons to act as a guardian of that Constitution. And so I have proposed that impeachment should be set out in a new blueprint in an Impeachment Act. And the advantages of actually having impeachment would serve as a deterrent to ensure or to help ensure compliance with accepted constitutional norms. Quite clear that impeachment would no longer have a criminal basis, would be no criminal sanctions, would leave criminal conduct to the ordinary courts, but impeachment would empower a small number of MPs, providing they pass the MPs, the speaker's filter, to actually launch proceedings, which would actually result in a committee of experts report with findings as to whether the conduct is potentially unconstitutional. So even before a vote in the Commons as to whether the Commons wishes to impeach, you would actually have a time-sensitive expert report outlining the fact about whether the conduct was unconstitutional. So you could have negative findings. The House does choose to impeach, which would depend upon party numbers. Then the matter would be referred to a court of impeachment, which would draw upon the Danish model and would actually be comprised of lay members and judicial members. And very much the focus would be on disqualification and removal from office, no criminal sanction. Now, I think I put forward just an idea to buttress the existing political accountability mechanisms and to actually focus on the perceived deficit in terms of ministerial compliance with the Constitution and to safeguard accepted constitutional norms. Thank you.